I think it's fair to say we've had a stimulating, informative, and provocative day. But I want to assure you that this day will not end with a whimper, but a bang. Our next and final speaker, Thomas Pogge, has a wealth of good ideas, and he manages to translate many of them into effective organizational approaches to attaining global justice, eliminating poverty, insisting on affordable health care, curtailing corruption, and much more. Professor Pogge doesn't just talk the talk or walk the walk. He moves at a galloping pace to right some of the most egregious wrongs of our society. He received his doctorate from Harvard with a dissertation supervised by the legendary John Rawls. He's published widely on Kant and in moral and political philosophy. I'm honored that he's taken the time to speak for the Schemmel Forum today. I'm confident that he will enlighten and disturb us and inspire us to join him in his passionate pursuit of global justice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pogge.
Good. So I'm very happy to follow on 3 such wonderful lectures, which I enjoyed greatly. And that means I don't have to be nervous, because you already have your money's worth. And if things don't go too well, it's not such a big deal. Okay, I should also tell you this is about justice today, because you've seen, a little bit about the heroic days where people struggled for justice in various ways, and you may wonder, what can you do today to advance justice? And this is what this will be about. So it will be more global, not so much focused on the United States, and it will be about the present day, period. I should also say, as one further continuity to the preceding lecture, David Blight lives directly underneath me. And every morning at 6:30, his alarm wakes me up. So I will absolutely do that. He's currently in Cambridge, but for this semester, so I get to sleep a little longer. So, good. So I'll talk about global justice. So let me tell you what global justice is. And first, the word justice is applied to different things. We apply it to agents and the conduct of agents. We apply it to social rules, practices, institutions. And we also apply it to states of the world, states of affairs. My focus here will be entirely on the third of these uses. So I will talk about what we call social justice, namely justice as applied to social rules, institutions, and practices. And I will more particularly talk about the justice of supranational institutional arrangements. So the last 25 years have seen a tremendous expansion in the density and influence of the international institutional regime. So many of the important things that happen, the important rules and regulations that govern interactions on our planet, not just intranational ones, but also purely domestic ones, are now constrained and regulated by this international rule system. In the US, you feel it less than anywhere else in the world, because the US is a very powerful state that often makes those international rules. But in many of the smaller and more marginal states, these international rules have become tremendously important. So that's what I will talk about, and in particular also about global justice and human rights. So we have at this stage, because of great cultural diversity in the world, not really consensus on any theory of global justice. So we don't really know what a full-bodied theory of global justice would look like. But we have the next best thing. We have agreement on some core of a conception of global justice, and the core is human rights. Human rights are sort of the lingua franca of international value discourse. Most people agree that whatever we need to achieve to make this planet a just planet, to achieve justice for humanity, we certainly have to achieve the fulfillment of human rights. And that agreement is one that is particularly narrow in 3 different dimensions. So we can agree on human rights as being the shared core of our respective value systems internationally. so long as we agree that this is to be understood narrowly in these three senses. First, that we don't demand the juridification of human rights. So often, this is the so-called Asian values debate, often the Chinese and the Singaporeans and so on say, we don't want to become like Americans, people who sue people all the time, who constantly insist on their rights and so on. So, but if you say, look, by human rights, we don't mean litigiousness. What we mean by that is that everybody has secure access to certain objects. Everybody has secure access to freedom of movement, to freedom of expression, to enough to eat. If that's what's meant, you can hopefully agree to it. So that's a narrower meaning. Secondly, we include among the objects of human rights only some very basic goods that are really essential even to the biological survival of human beings. So absolute deprivations, not relative deprivations. Having your human rights unfulfilled doesn't mean that you're worse off than others. It means that you are in a bad way in absolute terms. So you don't have enough to eat, you don't enjoy freedom of expression, freedom of movement, you're being tortured, and so on. And finally, the agreement becomes very wide if we confine the counterpart duties to negative duties. We say that when human rights are not being fulfilled, then certainly we have a duty to, with regard to that underfulfillment of human rights, insofar as we contribute. We don't necessarily have duties to protect and to help in all cases, but we do have duties to abstain from making the human rights situation worse, from contributing to the violation of human rights. So if you understand it narrowly in these senses, you can say that's a shared core that is very widely agreed in the world today as the essence, the narrow core essence of what global justice would require. We would all agree probably that justice requires more than that, but it requires at least this much. Now, I make the argument in 3 steps, and each step is sort of a little syllogism, if you like. And to make it transparent, I've laid out these steps for you here. So the first step of the argument has 3 stages, or 3 sub-steps, if you like. Under the present rules of the world economy, the human rights of most people foreseeably remain unfulfilled. Second, it's foreseeable that most of this human rights deficit would be reasonably avoidable with an alternative design of these same supranational rules. And then the conclusion from these 2, the present rules of the world economy foreseeably produce massive human rights deficits and are therefore extremely unjust. So these are pretty strong claims, and you predicted I would say something with a bit of a bang to it. So let me do something to support these claims. So premise 1, under the present rules of the world economy, the human rights of most people foreseeably remain unfulfilled. So let's look at a little bit of that. And I focus here on social and economic human rights because they are by far the most frequently unrealized human rights. So there are thousands of people who are being tortured, who are being imprisoned and so on. But there are literally millions, even hundreds of millions of people who do not enjoy the social and economic human rights recognized in the Universal Declaration and in the Covenant. So we have a little bit over 7 billion people these days, 7.1, 7.2, something like that. And among them, there are just under 1 billion people who are chronically undernourished on the very narrow definition that the Food and Agriculture Organization is using. That means you are for over a year, you do not have enough calorie intake for a sedentary lifestyle. So there are a lot more people who are severely hungry than the FAO is counting with that narrow definition. But 200 million people, 2,000 million people, 2 billion people lack access to essential medicines. 800 million lack safe drinking water. 1,600 million lack adequate shelter. 1,600 million lack electricity. 2,500 million, 2.5 billion lack adequate sanitation. 800 million adults are illiterate, and about over 200 million children do wage work outside of their own household. So very large numbers of people suffer from these quite severe deprivations, and if you take account of the overlap among them, it's certainly half of humankind that is suffering one or the other of these severe deprivations. Maybe even more dramatically, a very large number of deaths occur every year from poverty-related causes. So I estimate that that's about 1/3 of all human deaths, about 18 million a year. And they are basically the deaths. How does one estimate that? One looks at the WHO table of deaths and looks at the various causes of death, and then separates out those causes of death that are basically unknown in the rich countries. And you see them here. Diarrhea, right? How many people die of diarrhea in the United States? Well, very, very few. But about 2.1 million died in the first decade of this millennium every year from diarrhea, malnutrition, perinatal and maternal conditions, and so on. So this adds up to about 18 million, and that's a conservative estimate because, of course, many people in the developing countries die from causes that we know only too well, like diabetes, heart disease, and so on. And they often die much sooner than we do, much earlier, at earlier ages, because they have lousy medical care and because their environment makes them more vulnerable. And I've not counted any of those deaths at all. I've only counted the deaths from causes that are basically unknown among rich people, and even that already adds up to these 18 million. So if you put that in perspective, since the end of the Cold War, you've got roughly 400 million people dying from poverty-related causes, dying prematurely, and that is about twice as many people as died in the entire 20th century from all the wars, civil wars, gulags, concentration camps, in other words, from government violence. So it's really a problem that is much larger than we normally give it credit for. It's not something that is uppermost in our news media or in our public consciousness, but it is a very major and persistent problem, the problem of poverty. So the human right of all the ones in the Universal Declaration and then reaffirmed in the two covenants, of all the human rights that we recognize, the one that is least realized is this one here, that everyone has a right to a standard of living that is adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services. So that was the first premise, that a very, very large number of people do not have their human rights fulfilled in the world as we have it. Now, the second point is, the second premise is that foreseeably most of this human rights deficit that remains would be reasonably avoidable with an alternative design of these same rules. So obviously it could be the case that very large numbers of people suffer under fulfillment of their human rights, but this has nothing to do with the way our world system is organized, with the way our world economy works and so on. It could just be local factors. So I want to argue that a different institutional design of our world economy and of our world order more generally could prevent or forestall the majority of this human rights deficit. And that's a difficult case to make empirically in a short time, but I will give you at least a good bit of evidence to believe that. So let's start first of all with the global income distribution, which gives you a sense of how avoidable poverty might be today. So I do that in terms of a pie chart, and I begin with the richest 5% of the world's population, who have about 46% of global household income. So this leaves out government income. It's just the private income that all the people in the world together have. Then you take the next 20%. That's most of you are probably in the top 5% actually. Even if you're not in the top 5% in the US, you make it pretty easily into the top 5% of the world's population. So if you add the next 20%, you have the top quarter of the world's population, and you can see right off that they already have more than 90% of global income. The other 3/4 squeeze into the remaining space of 10%. And you can see here, if you have good eyes, how that happens. The smallest quarter is hard to see because it is only 0.78% of global household income. So a very small fraction of the world's income goes to the poorest quarter. So that gives you a bit of a sense already that in this day and age, given the size of the pie altogether, we could eradicate poverty with relative ease at little cost to the people in the top quarter. The wealth distribution, I should say, is even more unequal than the income distribution, and you can intuitively see that very easily by recognizing that most rich people have more wealth than they have annual income. They have more than one annual income in wealth, and most poor people have less than one annual income in wealth. And that shows that wealth disparities are even larger than income disparities. Now, here are two counter-arguments that I often hear when I talk about inequality and the avoidability of poverty. One counter-argument, and that comes out of the Millennium Development Goals, is that people say, but aren't things getting better? Don't we read in the newspaper that poverty is going down and that hunger is going down and that many things have improved over the last so many years? So the percentages of poor people are going down, the absolute numbers are maybe going down, there are significant measurement issues. The various organizations in charge of measurement, the World Bank and the FAO, have changed their methodologies several times, and with each change of methodology you have a rosier trend picture, so we should be a little bit suspicious of that. But let that go for this lecture. Let me just say that the key thing to remember is that the poor, to the extent that they have in fact gotten better off over the last, let's say, 25 years since 1990, when the MDGs, they used that as their base year, even if that is true, they would have gotten a lot better off if they had merely kept pace with global economic growth. So the share of income that goes to the poor has shrunk throughout that period. I will show that a little later. And so with all the efforts that we supposedly made, all the great effort of lifting people out of poverty and so on, the poor would have done vastly better if merely they had proportionately participated in global economic growth. And then, even more importantly, the key question that we have to ask ourselves is not, do poor people get better off or not? The key question that we have to ask ourselves is how much of the poverty that's there is actually unavoidable. Right? We should measure the existing amount of poverty not by saying that 20 years ago it was even worse, but by saying how much better could we now make it? What would now be possible? So if I may briefly allude back to your lecture about slavery, right? If somebody had in 1850, let's say, defended slavery by saying, but look, what are you complaining about? The blacks are better off than they were 30 years ago. 30 years ago, there was more of a splitting of families. There was more of whipping and raping of slaves. So things are getting better. What's the problem? Right? We would have said that's an inadequate response. Slavery is something that should be abolished. It's an injustice. And I think we should take a similar attitude also with regard to poverty. Right? The fact that poverty is maybe getting better, that it was even worse 20, 30 years ago, is no defense of maintaining it if it is indeed unavoidable. If it is indeed avoidable, sorry. So the history then is one that often misleads us into a sense of complacency. We say, look, people have always been poor. There have always been lots of poor people. For most of human history, the majority of human beings were poor. And that's true. But what we have to realize is the totally new phenomenon that poverty today is very easily avoidable. There's a grotesque mismatch between the human magnitude of poverty, a third of all human deaths, half of all human beings living in poverty and so on the one hand, and the totally minuscule dimensions of the poverty problem in economic terms. It's a matter of 2% of global income that the poor are lacking that would wipe out poverty for good. And so it is today, really, in terms of the effort required, a very, very small problem. We are just not doing it, and I think we should. Now, another counter-argument that I often encounter is the argument that people say, look, it can't be the case that this has anything to do with the way we structure the world economy. And the reason is that poverty develops differently in different locations. So you have success stories like Botswana and Korea and Singapore and China recently. And then you have these basket case stories like Senegal and Niger and so on, where poverty continues. Now, in view of these divergences, how can you say the global order is to blame? It must be local factors that explain why poverty persists where it persists. This argument is so popular that you find it almost every week in The Economist magazine. And I want to at least briefly tell you why this is not a good argument. What the argument clearly shows is that local factors matter. Nobody would ever deny that. Of course, local factors matter. What the argument doesn't show is that global factors don't matter. And that's my claim. My claim is that global factors matter as well. So let me try to bring this across with an analogy. Right? I teach at a place called Yale, and unlike the University of Scranton, we have unequal success of the students. Right? Here in Scranton, they all succeed. At Yale, we have a few sort of students who do poorly. And so at the end of the semester, they haven't learned a lot, and other students have learned a lot. So there's big diversity. So now what I can conclude is that my qualities as a teacher have nothing to do with learning success of the students, right? Because there's great diversity. Some do well, some do poorly, so it can't be me, right? Am I making this clear? So that's obviously a completely idiotic argument, right? And this idiotic argument is the argument that The Economist magazine is repeating on its pages on a weekly basis. So let's think about the teaching example for a moment, right? Obviously, if I were a better teacher, all my students would do better. If I were even worse, they would all do worse. But not only that, also by selecting certain teaching styles and teaching materials, I am making it easier for some students to learn and harder for others. So, for example, I'm working with numerical slides sometimes. I show people some numbers on the board. The numerophobes among my students, they will be turned off by that. They get scared. They say, oh, numbers, I don't know how to deal with them. So they learn worse than they would learn if I didn't use numbers. But then other students, those who come from the sciences, they love numbers and they really understand numbers. And so they learn better, thanks to my style, than they would do if I didn't use numbers. And so even the differences among the students are influenced by the teacher. And one other example, students differ in their motivation, right? Some students are very eager and highly motivated, others are not. This seems to be a quintessential student-specific factor. And yet, motivation, of course, is influenced by the teacher, right? If a teacher cracks sexist jokes, half the audience will turn off and they'll say, oh, this is an old fuddy-duddy who is from the pre-diluvian times and obviously doesn't know, why should he have anything interesting to say about anything else if that's his attitude about women students? So again, the student-specific factors may well be influenced by the factor teacher. So in all these different ways, the global factor teacher is the same teacher for all the students, can have a profound influence on the performance of the students, even if at the end of the semester we have found that some students do better and others do poorly. And that's exactly what I want to say about global institutional factors. So the design of our world economy has a profound impact on the performance of countries and in particular on the performance with regard to poverty, and that is not refuted by the fact that some countries have eradicated poverty relatively quickly, and poverty has persisted in other countries. So it's just a very bad argument. So that's the, done this already. So let me say a little bit now about what factors I think are important. There are, of course, countless factors, right? This institutional rule architecture at the supranational level these days has become very dense, very complicated. There's a lot of stuff there. I can't talk about everything. But I'll give a few examples. And these institutional features at the global level, they work to some extent directly, influencing the life prospects of poor and vulnerable populations in the developing world. And they also work to some extent indirectly by influencing the national institutional schemes of the various less developed countries. So one thing that you're all familiar with is protectionism, I take it. Protectionism is something that the World Trade Organization was supposed to phase out, but the rich countries prevailed upon the WTO to allow certain protectionist measures to be grandfathered in. And so we still have various protectionist measures, such as, for example, anti-dumping duties, quotas, tariffs, export credits, subsidies in agriculture, that are still making it harder for exports from the developing world to enter the rich countries' markets, and more importantly also make it harder for them to compete in world markets where we have subsidized products that go into world markets where they cannot afford to subsidize their products. In the US, it's cotton. In the European theater, it's dairy products that are flooding world markets at artificially low prices and thereby displace potential export opportunities for the poor countries. Pharmaceuticals. It's part of the World Trade Organization agreement that all the countries that want to be members of the WTO have to sign up to a very stringent and strong intellectual property regime. So they have to promise to protect intellectual property rights, in particular in pharmaceuticals, where it's really important, also in seeds, where it's quite important. But with pharmaceuticals, this has been a revolution that has made people in the developing world vastly worse off than they were before. So before, under the old patent regime of India, for example, which is the most important country in this regard, India had 7-year process patents. So they had patents that protected a certain way of making a medicine. And if you had the patent, nobody could make the medicine in the way that you had patented to make it. But they could invent around the patent. They could find a different way of making the same medicine and could then sell the medicine cheaply in India and also across the developing world. Not, of course, in the rich countries, because in the rich countries, patent laws were much stronger. And that's what the Indians did. But with the new WTO rules, the so-called TRIPS agreement, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, India had to change its patent regime and now has 20-year product patents. A product patent protects the molecule, doesn't matter how it's made, and so patients now need to wait until the 20-year patent period has expired until they can get access to the product, because they cannot afford medicines at these very high prices that pharmaceutical companies charge when they have a product under patent. So that has made the provisioning of poor populations with medicines, with advanced medicines that are relatively new and still under patent, very much worse, and has led to countless deaths, probably millions and millions of deaths in India and throughout the developing world. So that's the story with pharmaceuticals. Pollution is an interesting counterexample in that while we have very strong rules about pharmaceuticals, for example, how every country has to regulate, they all get a constraint on how they have to nationally legislate with regard to intellectual property rights. With pollution rules, we leave it quite open for countries to decide on their own. And so the great harms that the high pollution countries are imposing on the world, and in particular on vulnerable populations in the developing world, are not compensated for in any way. We basically reap the largest benefits from pollution. Most of the consumption in the world of high polluting consumer goods and so on is done by us. We, for example, in terms of energy consumption, we are twice the level of the Europeans and somewhere around probably 8 or 10 times the level of the Indians. So we pollute a great deal, and we don't compensate those who are harmed by this pollution for the effects of that pollution. Illicit financial flows, that stands for mainly two different things. One is that there is a great deal of embezzlement going on throughout the developing world, which is facilitated by secret bank accounts, secrecy jurisdictions that are still maintained that we could clamp down on but don't. So a great deal of money is simply stolen from government coffers or from development aid and then parked into secret bank accounts for private use. And the other thing is tax evasion and tax avoidance, in which most multinational corporations are prominently involved. So I'll give you a brief example of how this multinational tax evasion, tax avoidance scheme works. It's basically a matter of shuffling profits from developing countries into tax havens. So if you're a multinational corporation and you have subsidiaries in many different countries, then you will try to trade within your company across the various subsidiaries in such a way that your profits will accumulate where they attract the lowest taxes. So let me give a concrete example. Let's say you manufacture in India and you sell in South Africa, and you make a very handsome profit. Now, how do you avoid paying taxes? Well, you avoid it in the following way. After you produce in India, you sell your products to the Cayman Islands at a very low price. Your subsidiary, both are your subsidiaries, so you're trading from your left pocket to your right pocket. So because the price is low, you pay no taxes in India because you had no profits in India. Then you sell from your Cayman Island subsidiary to your South African subsidiary at a high price. High enough so that you again have no profit in South Africa because you bought expensively, and so, sorry, no profit, no taxes. All your profit is in the Cayman Islands, where the rate on corporate profit is 0. So you accumulate the money there, pay no taxes on it. It's totally routine. They all do it, and they all save enormous amounts of taxes on it. So this is something which we could very easily avoid, on the one hand by shutting down tax havens, but also by changing the tax code in such a way that we have a minimum tax on corporations regardless of where their profits are. But as it is, there is the deprivation of poor countries in particular who have the lowest capacity to enforce their tax laws and to actually check out what these companies are doing. The goods, of course, never go to the Cayman Islands. They go straight from India to South Africa, but the invoices go via the Cayman Islands, where there is a nice lawyer with a telephone and a desk who is managing 55 different companies just with one person and one desk. So illicit financial flows, basically embezzlement and tax evasion, tax avoidance. And these illicit financial flows also cause a lot of political damage in the developing world, right? We look at the developing world and we often shake our heads and say, why don't these people govern themselves properly like we do? Have proper government institutions and so on. Well, the answer is not that they are somehow inferior or that they somehow don't like good government. The answer is that they can't help it, right? They have an enormous price set on anybody who can manage to bring the government under their control. They can steal billions of dollars. They can sell the country's resources. They can hire themselves the soldiers they need to stay in power and shuffle large amounts of money into bank accounts in Switzerland or in various tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. And so the attractions of grabbing power by force are enormous. The penalties are relatively small. And so it's not very surprising that a lot of these countries are very poorly governed, and that causes corruption, it causes civil war, it causes repression, which is also further supported by these four privileges, namely the fact that we, in particular the developed northern or western countries, are recognizing any person or group who exercises power in one of these countries as entitled to sell us the resources of the people and as entitled to borrow money in the name of the people. So if I take my machine gun and I walk into a department store and take it over, I cannot confer legally valid property rights in the stuff that the department store sells to other people, right? If I sell you something after I've taken over the department store, you don't become the legitimate owner of the stuff I've sold you by paying me money. But if you do that in a country, it works. So if you take your machine gun, you take over a country, like an African country, for example, and you then sell oil and other precious minerals to foreigners, the foreigners become the legitimate owners of these things, according to the understanding of property rights that we have. And that's, again, a very questionable part of our global institutional structure, that we recognize any person or group on the basis of sheer power alone, regardless of how they came to power, regardless of how they exercise power, regardless of whether they do anything in the interest of the people, as entitled, on the one hand, to sell us the resources, and on the other hand, of borrowing money that we then hold the whole country responsible for repaying. So countries like Nigeria and the Congo and so on are still chafing under debt burdens accumulated under dictators such as Sani Abacha and Mobutu Sese Seko. And of course, they have lost enormous amounts of natural resources that were simply plundered during the reign of those dictators. These are the people's resources, not the resources of whoever grabs power by force. And I think we should recognize that. Arms trade, obvious further problem, right? We try very, very hard to sell weapons into the developing world and are selling billions and billions of weapons in dollars worth of weapons in competition with the British, the Russians, the Chinese, the Germans, and so on. And again, virtually all these arms sales are doing harm. There's very little, if any, good reason for these weapons to be there. They're used ultimately for government repression, civil war, and so on. And then another case of non-existing standards, labor standards. We don't have any labor standards in this elaborate international rule architecture, any kind of minimum standards about how workers should be treated. And as a consequence, they are treated in many countries very, very badly, because poor countries are forced into a competition, a race to the bottom, as it's often called, where they compete with each other in order to attract foreign capital. Just saying, look, come to us, come to Vietnam, come to Bangladesh, come here because here the workers are even more exploitable, even more mistreatable than they are in this other country. Unions, never heard of, doesn't exist. Bathroom breaks, no. Can you beat people? Can you sexually harass them? Of course you can. Come here. Invest your money here. Have a factory here. And again, if we had uniform labor standards, minimal, very minimal labor standards about how workers can be treated and how much or how little they can be paid or should be paid, that would put a floor under this competition of all against all and would stop the race to the bottom, or at least constrain the race to the bottom that leads to these horrific labor standards. You've probably seen recently the big fire, the garment fire in Bangladesh, right? So that is just one sort of tip of the iceberg sort of example of how workers are treated in many of these places. Now, why is that happening? Why are the rules that we have established in these 25 years since the end of the Cold War, this very thick and very influential rule architecture, why is it so hostile to the poor? Who is hating the poor so much? I don't think anybody's hating the poor very much, but there are people who do love themselves. And it's those people who love themselves who are working very hard to create rules that are friendly to themselves, that allow them to make more money. And this is a phenomenon that you all know. That's as old as the world, or almost as old as the world. The second profession in the world, presumably, is that of the lobbyist, the person who influences the strong guys, right, the big guys, and is trying to curry favor with people in power. And so we have inequality spirals that arise from the fact that those who are already better off than others are in a better position to lobby and to influence the making and application of the rules in their own favor. That's also often known as regulatory capture. It's very well analyzed by economists and social scientists in general. So the strongest participants have the greatest opportunities and incentives to acquire the knowledge and expertise that they need and to coordinate with one another to engage in effective lobbying. Let me give a real-life example. The tax rate for hedge fund managers, as you all probably know, is 15%. That's the most they pay in taxes. It's 15% because their income, even though it's not their own capital invested, but it counts as a capital gain, and so they pay only the capital gains tax rate. Now, I and probably most of you pay more than 15% in taxes. Now, why is it that hedge fund managers have their own tax rate? Well, it has something to do with their ability to lobby, right? The Congress people, when you ask them, they all say this is a scandal, shouldn't happen. Of course, this has to be abolished. But whenever they vote on it, they keep it in place. And presumably somebody pays them for keeping it in place. The point is that for hedge fund managers, people who make in the hundreds of millions each year in income, it's very lucrative for 5 or 6 of them to get together and say, look, let's just lobby. We pay a few $1 million to these guys in Washington, and we keep our nice tax rate. It's a very good investment. Now try that to get a special tax rate for philosophy professors, which is what I am. Now, apart from the obvious problem that philosophers never agree on anything, but you couldn't do it with 5 philosophers, right? If 5 philosophers each gave 1% of their income, we'd have a few dollars, not enough to lobby with. So in order to do a serious lobbying effort, you would need about 20,000 philosophers instead of 5 hedge fund managers, right, to get the same amount of money together and so on. So there you see why it is that lobbying often helps those who are near the top already, right? Those who are, because they can coordinate much more easily, they can form a group much more easily, acquire the expertise, all much more cost effective for them because they're dealing with much, much larger amounts. It's not worth it for a little philosophy professor to think about, how can I reduce my tax rate by a few $100s, but for a hedge fund manager, a few percentage points are worth a few $1 million, and then it is worth serious efforts. Good, so inequality spirals, it's something that's familiar, it's been analyzed, you've heard about it, you've probably read about it. But let me give you a few more spectacular little tidbits about how much you can actually do with lobbying. So here is a company called Strategas, which is running an index, basically. And the index is they take, every quarter, they take out of the S&P 500, the 500 large companies in the S&P 500, they take the 50 companies that relative to their assets spend the most on lobbying. And so how is the Strategas 50 doing relative to the S&P 500? Well, between 2002 and 2011, they did 11% better. This is straight out of The Economist magazine, not a biased source in my favor, at least. Biased they are, but not in my favor. So you can see here the S&P 500 didn't do anything during that period. But the lobbying index, the 50 shares in the Strategas, it's changing every quarter. Every quarter they revise it. But they did spectacularly better than the S&P 500. So I've never seen in my rather limited experience with stock market gurus and so on, I've never seen anything that works as well as this. So you should find out, if you learn anything today that is actually useful, you should find out what are the companies that spend the most money on lobbying and just invest in those stocks. And every quarter or every few months, look at it again and retool your investments, and you will become quite rich. And then you can do your own lobbying. Okay. So that's one piece of evidence for the success of lobbying, that it really makes a difference. And here's another one. This is a very careful article by 3 people that you can see here at the top. I've quoted part of the abstract here. And they just took one example where it was pretty obvious. It was the American Jobs Creation Act of 2004, which is a bit of a misnomer. No jobs were created with that act, but money was repatriated. Lots and lots and lots, billions of dollars came into the US from the tax havens. And so these people saved a lot of taxes. So basically how this worked, this American Job Creation Act, is this. I told you earlier how these multinationals shuffle their profits into tax havens, right? Now the problem with that is that if you shuffle your profits into tax havens, that's where the money is. And now if you want to bring this money home, as you do, into the United States, you still have to pay taxes on it. Because then it goes to your mother company, so to speak, and the mother company is getting from one of its subsidiaries income and has to pay taxes on that income. So what these companies do is they basically don't bring the money home, and they wait and lobby for a tax holiday. So they go to the Congress after a while, whenever there's sort of a talk about unemployment being too high or something. They go to the Congress and they say, look, you know, we have all this money sitting around in the tax havens, and being patriots, we would really love to bring this money to the United States, and we would love to create a few jobs. And couldn't you please, you know, we'll also support your next campaign, of course, couldn't you please allow us to bring this money in, but not at 35%, at some lower rate? So with this American Jobs Creation Act, they reduced the taxes by 85%, so from 35% to 5.25%. And so these big companies brought back hundreds of billions of dollars at 5.25%. And it's an interesting case because, I mean, you can actually measure exactly how much they spent on lobbying because the corporate reports have that written in. So these people found out exactly how much money was spent on the lobbying effort and how much taxes were saved. And the ratio is 220 to 1. So for every dollar that they spent on lobbying, they got $220 in tax savings by paying 5.25% instead of 35% in taxes. And it's also interesting because you can see here the international repercussions of this, right? The whole point of shuffling money into tax havens would be defeated if they didn't get that tax holiday. Why? Because if they paid the full 35%, then they might as well pay the taxes in South Africa and in India because they can subtract them fully from the 35%. They get a tax credit to the extent that they pay taxes abroad. But of course, if the US tax is very low, they cannot subtract more than the US tax. So if the US tax is at 5%, they can't subtract the 20% they paid in South Africa. So that's why they need to first channel it into a tax haven and then wait for the tax holiday to be organized so that they can then bring it home at a very low percentage. So if we didn't have the tax holiday, South Africa and India and all the developing countries wouldn't have been cheated out of their fair share of taxes that these multinationals owe. All right, so here is a little bit more evidence how this lobbying, which has really intensified a lot, also with globalization, because you can now lobby the US government on 2 fronts. You can lobby them with regard to purely domestic rules and regulations, and you can lobby them even more lucratively with regard to international rules and regulations, which the US has a very heavy influence on shaping and creating. So let's look at how that has influenced the US income distribution. I don't know whether you know a bit about the US income distribution, how it's changed, but here you see it. The bottom half of the US population has seen its share go down by more than 50% in the period from 1978 to 2007. And people at the top have correspondingly seen their shares increase. So the top 1% has increased by 2.6-fold from 9% to 23.5%. The top 0.1% has gone up 4.6-fold from 2.65 to 12.28%. And the top 100th of 1% has gone up from 0.86 to 6.04%. That's 30,000 people, 14,400 tax returns. You can see this information is straight from the IRS. So, enormous increase at the very top. And these 30,000 people at the top of the US income hierarchy, they have now nearly half as much income as the bottom half of Americans, so nearly half as much income as the bottom 150 million. And they have, which is even more incredible, more income than the bottom 40% of the world's population. So 30,000 people at the top have more income than 2.8 billion people at the bottom. Again, remember what I said earlier about how easy it would be to eradicate poverty. Here is the total chart. This information is developed by some economists from IRS records. You can find it if you go to the personal website of Emmanuel Saez, S-A-E-Z, or Z. You can find it there, updated to the latest year. So I took 2007 because there was a bit of a dip afterwards, but you can find it all the way to 2012 now. Now that's remarkable because in the period between 28 and 78, income inequality in the US declined very steadily. There was more and more equality in the US, and that reversed at the end of the Carter presidency. Then, of course, Reagan, Thatcher came, and then globalization gave it another huge boost. So Republican and Democratic presidencies didn't make a difference. Inequality increased dramatically even under Clinton. And it's now reached, as you can see here, the old peak of 1928, the pre-depression peak. We are there and even a little bit above it. So, and of course, the tendency is rising. Maybe you've read in the last few days when Saez published the 2012 data, 95% of economic growth since the 2008 financial debacle, 95% of that growth went to the top 1% of the US population. 5% went to the other 99%. So, supranational rule shaping is a very important part of that story. So, lobbying has become so much more lucrative and so much more effective because, as I said, you can now lobby the US government not only with regard to domestic legislation, but also with regard to international rule shaping. The TRIPS agreement that I mentioned about intellectual property rights is a paradigm example. It was 4 industries that got together, bridged their differences, and then descended upon Washington, upon Clinton in the state, trying to get him to bring home the bacon and saying, if we do this WTO thing, fine, we think that's a great idea, but get us this intellectual property rights agreement. Get everybody to sign up. Nobody should be a member of the WTO. Nobody should get most favored nation status unless they sign up to these very much more stringent intellectual property rights. The 4 industries, you can guess which they were. It was the pharmaceutical industry, the agribusinesses, the entertainment industry, and the software industry. So they got together, they had all slightly different interests, but they bridged their differences and then with their combined force basically made Clinton a request that he couldn't refuse. And sure enough, he brought home the TRIPS agreement, basically made it a condition for any country that wants to join the WTO that they also had to sign up for intellectual property rights. So this international lobbying is actually easier to do than the national lobbying because there's no democratic counterweight. Here in the US, you have to bother with the voters who also have a say and a voice. Internationally, there is no democracy. There's very little transparency. That's another huge difference. If in the US Congress, before they can pass a law, they have to announce it, right? So we all, as citizens, we can see what is being debated in the Congress. We can weigh in, we can blog about it, we can organize demonstrations, we can write to our Congress people and whatever. But international negotiations happen behind closed doors. You don't know what the draft text is. You don't know what they are debating. And even afterwards, when the text is published, you get to see the published version, but you don't get to see who argued for what. How did Article 2 get in there? Why was Article 3b in this language rather than that language, and so on? Well, you can often guess, but still it's difficult to hold anybody accountable, anybody in particular accountable for these texts. And that, of course, is the ideal environment in which lobbyists and also those who do get lobbied successfully can hide their tracks. They can say afterwards, well, that was what we all agreed on, rather than saying, well, I argued for it, I pushed for it because such and such an industry or such and such a multinational company was pushing me to do so. Finally, moral constraints, right? We are often constrained morally that we say, no, no, we can't do that. But in the international arena, moral constraints are easily kept at bay because you can say, well, it's not nice to do what we are about to do, but you know, we are in a jungle here. We are competing with those Chinese or the Russians or whatever it is. And you think they are nice? They're fighting without gloves. And so, of course, we have to be tough and we have to be selfish because otherwise we will not prevail in the long run. We cannot hold our own with one hand tied behind our backs if we are fighting people like the Russians, the Chinese, or whatever your favorite adversary may be. And guess what they say, the Russians and the Chinese? They say the same thing, right? We can't be nice in the international arena because we are competing with these Americans and they are, you know, tough and they really go to the brink of what they can do to get their own advantage and so on and so forth. All right. So the most cost-effective lobbying, and this is the new story about lobbying, is now done with regard to international rules. Companies are spending enormous amounts of resources trying to lobby the US government, which is still the strongest kid on the block, for rules and regulations at the international level, and also, of course, for non-regulation in certain areas that is beneficial for them. And it's just a side effect, a foreseeable but not particularly noticed side effect, that as these powerful agents are increasing their own share of the social product of the world, they are thereby indirectly diminishing the share that is left for the poor. So that's how I explain this tendency of increasing polarization, that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. It's a side effect of the rich getting richer, which in turn is an effect of very effective, very professional lobbying efforts. So what's happening then is these companies are trying to shift decision-making upward because it's easier to lobby at the international level than at the national level. And they're also then trying to influence the decision-making, the rule-setting at the international level in their own favor to get the rules and regulations they want. Here you can see the global income distribution in a little. So this is the distribution in 1988. The global distribution, I showed you that before as a pie chart. It's the same information again with the picture of the Earth. And this is the distribution in 2005. So you can see what happened here. The top 5% gained from 43 to 46 and some percent, so roughly 3.5% gain. All the other segments of the human population lost. And clearly, the people in the bottom quarter lost the most. They lost about 1/3 of their share of global household income. So they went from 1.16% down to 0.78%. And the bottom half also lost significantly. As you can see, the second quarter from the bottom also lost significantly, albeit not quite as much. Yeah, I can't go backwards, unfortunately. But you get the picture, right? That very substantial losses, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, very substantial losses specifically for the bottom half and the bottom quarter. So quickly recapping the key facts. So in these 17 years, from 88 to 05, the richest 5% of human beings gained 3.5% of global household income, which is more than the bottom half, 10 times as many people, had left at the end of the period. So just the gain for the top 5% is larger than the entire remaining share for the bottom half of humanity. That's big time for a 17-year period. the ratio of average incomes of the richest 5% versus the poorest quarter rose from 185 to 1 to 297 to 1. Had the poorer half merely held steady, they would now be 21% better off than they are. And had the poorest quarter held steady, they would be 49% better off than they are. So remember that again in connection with all our self-congratulation about how many people will be lifted out of poverty, right? How much better they would be off if they had simply stayed in place in terms of their relative share of global household income. And finally, if the very same 3.5% that were added to the share of the top 5% of the human population, if that had gone to the bottom half of the human population, poverty would be finished already. They would have gone from 3.5% to 7% of global household income, and that would have easily wiped out all severe poverty, all these horrors that I started my lecture with. So 3.5% is well above what it would take to erase severe poverty of the sort that we are here concerned with. We had exactly that shift, but it went in the wrong direction. It went to the top 5%. So the conclusion then is that the present rules of the world economy foreseeably produce massive human rights deficits and are therefore extremely unjust. That's the first step of the argument. There are two more steps, but don't worry, I will deal with them much quicker. So the point then is that, as I see it, international law is schizophrenic. It's divided against itself. We have, and that we are proud of, and we remember it fondly, we have in international law now, since the Second World War, all these human rights treaties and provisions, high-sounding language, really beautiful, inspiring treaties and articles. And that's visible, that's widely recognized, and we celebrate it. And we use it to criticize one another and also maybe to criticize ourselves, to improve our performance and so on. But international law also contains a lot of other stuff that rules the world economy, the WTO treaty and so on, many other structuring devices that are of profound importance for the economy of the world and how the real world works. And these rules systematically violate the human rights that are in the Sunday part of international law. And that violates then what is maybe one of the most remarkable human rights articles in the Universal Declaration, namely this demand that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. So that's a right that we all have, supposedly, the right to an international order that makes it possible for human rights to be fulfilled for all. That is possible now, but the international order systematically obstructs it. And so we still have these very, very large numbers of people who are finding their human rights unfulfilled. So I'll quickly run through steps 2 and 3 without a lot of the evidence for them, but just to show you how the argument then leads to conclusions about our obligations. So this is the conclusion of the first step, that the present rules of the world economy massively violate human rights. And then I want to say that agents who actively contribute to the design or imposition of foreseeably human rights non-compliant rules are thereby violating human rights. And that is true of our governments. The governments of the more powerful states, and the United States in particular, is very heavily, these governments are very heavily involved in designing and imposing the present rules of the world economy and are thereby massively violating human rights. So this is, in one sense, a little bit of a non-standard interpretation, perhaps, of Article 28 and what it demands. We think, when we think of Article 28, often of positive efforts that we should make. The word progressive realization often crops up there, which is very similar to with all deliberate speed, which basically means do it at your own pace, take your sweet time. And that may be appropriate with regard to positive duties, where you are trying to improve things, and that's how we think about international institutions. We think that maybe we should sometimes think about how we can improve them and how we can make them better and so on. But what we should think about, I think, is the negative interpretation of Article 28, namely we should ask ourselves, what right do we have to impose upon the world rules that foreseeably and avoidably perpetuate this enormous amount of poverty that we see in the world? And once we see it in that way, namely as a negative duty not to do harm, we will see that these rules have to be revised immediately. We have to immediately stop imposing economic rules upon the world that we know from experience perpetuate this enormous human rights deficit. The third step then is, if our governments are responsible, then of course we are also responsible. This is our government. The government is acting in our name. We are the citizens of that country. We are strengthening its hand in international negotiations. And if we as citizens are not responsible for the government, then who is, right? It's our policy, our foreign policy. And so citizens who are supporting or tolerating unjust policies of their government without making adequate reform or compensation efforts thereby become co-responsible for these unjust policies. And most citizens are not making any kinds of efforts to reform US foreign policy in these regards, and therefore share responsibility for the fact that the present global economic order is massively human rights violating. So this is basically the conclusion that I want to reach. And what difference that makes to our normal moral thinking is brought out best if we think about the duties that we have relative to the human rights that remain unfulfilled, if we think about them in these four categories. The duties that we normally put at the top of our hierarchy of duties are duties that we have to our own compatriots not to harm them, not to violate actively their human rights. Then we think that somewhat less important are the positive duties to promote and protect the human rights of our compatriots. Less important still are negative duties to foreigners, to outsiders. And finally, least important are the positive duties that we owe to foreigners, to help them, to protect them, and so on. So we think of our human rights correlated duties in a kind of hierarchy where the negative duties to our compatriots are at the top and the positive duties to owe to foreigners are at the bottom. So what I've made here is two different moves, one that I've already made, one that I want to make in conclusion. The first move is to say that much of the underfulfillment of human rights abroad is not just a matter of us helping too little, where we could do more to promote, more to protect. That's how we like to see it, right? We are the knight in shining armor who comes to the rescue of poor people who can't manage their own affairs. But we are also, and more fundamentally, in many ways, causing the very human rights problems that we then find to be an occasion for maybe aid and protection. We cause them by maintaining a global, in particular economic order, that foreseeably and avoidably maintains high poverty, increases inequality so that poor people do not participate proportionately in economic growth. So many of the human rights deficits that we find abroad are not merely the product of our doing too little to help, but also the product of our doing too much to harm. And that brings me to the second point, that is that I don't think, contrary to many others, that negative duties towards foreigners have less weight than negative duties towards our compatriots. With positive duties, yes, we have more reason to help and support people in our own country than we have to help and support foreigners. But when it comes to harming people, harming a foreigner is just as bad as harming a compatriot. So let me give a homely example for that. Suppose that spring break has happened, it's finished, students come back, and a student comes to my office hours and I say, well, how was your spring break? And the student says, well, it was fun, but there was one sort of really nasty thing that happened. I came home drunk one night and I killed a child as I was driving home. Fortunately, the police where I was in Romania, they didn't pay attention, it didn't really matter. And so I say, well, isn't it terrible to have run over a child, to have driven drunk so that you endanger other people? And he said, well, yes, you shouldn't do that, but you know, it was in Romania and there were no Americans anywhere near, and the only people I was endangering were these Romanians. Now, do you think that that's a good comment? Do you think that it's less important not to drive drunk in Romania, where you endanger only Romanians, than it is not to drive drunk in the United States, where the people you endanger are American citizens? I don't think so. So I think that with helping, there is this gradient, but with not harming, this gradient has very little or no moral significance. And so what I'm basically doing is saying that this problem of poverty that we pay so little attention to, poverty abroad in the developing world, is one that doesn't deserve to be in that bottom right category of the least important of all positive duties that I and my government owe to distant strangers, but it should be in the very most important category, namely negative duties where the distinction between foreigners and compatriots is morally insignificant. So that leaves us then with the responsibility that we share with our government and compatriots for the injustice of the international rules as they are, and with two citizen responsibilities that we have with regard to that poverty problem, namely to work towards supranational institutional reforms, try to get our government to pay attention, try to make our government think not only what's good for American firms, but also think about what is important and needful for ordinary people throughout the developing world. And secondly, insofar as we maybe are unable to work politically for reforms, to do what we can to compensate for some of the damage that we are also together involved in doing. Thank you.
I have a question that relates actually to things that we talked about earlier today. When the abolitionists first began to put their movement in high gear in the middle of the 19th century to do away with slavery, they were faced with an argument that said, slavery has existed in this country since 1619. It is now 1860. The institution has been legal and lucrative. It has contributed substantially to an economic regime that has made many people comfortable and independent. It has produced winners and it has produced losers, but overall there have been more of the first than the second. In response to that notion that this institution is in fact legal and guaranteed by the Constitution, the abolitionists argued there's a higher law than the Constitution, but it was a law that had to be intuitively perceived. Sometimes they use the expression in their appeals to the universal sentiments of mankind, also something of an abstraction. But there was a momentum for some reason in the middle of the 19th century behind the notion that slavery had to go. I'm really not sure where that momentum came from. That at that point in history, an institution that had been legal and profitable for centuries is suddenly now totally unacceptable. Fast forward to right now. What I'd like to know is, in your argument, what are you appealing to? What kind of value are you appealing to which would inform any project to address the question of global poverty, where again the argument would be, it is true that there are some who are suffering, but the overall majority are doing well. And once again, you have a system that has made winners and losers, and that seems to be an inevitable part of every human equation. And so my question, again, is what is the principle that you're relying on to move the hearts and minds of people? Secondly, do you see any momentum at this time that would be analogous to that momentum in the middle of the 19th century that sought to do away with slavery? And the third thing is, do you often feel like a voice crying in the wilderness?
Not in this room. So,
this is the choir.
Yeah, that I have to say. And the 3 lectures that went before also, I think, were very much in the spirit of what I'm trying to do. And so recalling a certain history of social change and social movements that I think we can connect this anti-poverty movement to. So I see a strong parallel between the abolition of poverty and the abolition of slavery. I think that these are quite continuous. But let me say a few things about the good points that you make. So the first thing is that the argument that this is a system that has worked pretty well and that has been giving more benefits to the winners than it has imposed losses on the losers, that's been good on the whole, is an argument that you should always be suspicious of, I think, when it is made by the people who are among the winners, right? And so we heard, I think you were very eloquent about slavery. I mean, the harms of slavery, the suffering of slavery, the misery of being enslaved is quite enormous, what people went through. And what it means to be sold down the river, what it means to be split up as a couple, to be split from your children and so on, to be whipped to the point of losing consciousness and so on. These things are things that are very, very hard to make up for by the joys of being a plantation owner. You know, you get some sadistic pleasures, maybe like in the recent Django movie we saw, whatever the name of the Titanic actor is, I forget, but what's his name? DiCaprio, that's right, sorry. So anyway, this calculation, if you really made a serious calculation to the extent that that is possible, I think you would find that the costs of slavery vastly outweighed the benefits of slavery. So, and even with the benefits, it's doubtful that there were significant benefits, right? There are sort of some people who even doubt that the economic benefits were really great, and many people say that slavery was finally abolished because it was an economically inefficient system. It didn't even deliver these benefits. But if it did deliver benefits, I think the harms were vastly greater. So what I'm appealing to basically is very similar to what we heard at the very first lecture this morning, right? We have this resounding Declaration of Independence, and once a sentence like that is uttered in a prominent place, all men are created equal, it's very difficult to put that back in the bottle and say, ah, this was just sort of, you know, when we talked to George, but we didn't really mean that for the consumption of people in our own country or for black people and so on. So there are powerful ideas, and the idea of human rights is also one such idea. So I think that the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed in the aftermath of this horrendous Second World War, was a document that has the same sort of appeal that the Declaration of Independence had. And the sentences uttered there, everybody has this right to a social international order in which all the freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized and so on. The right to a minimum standard of living. These things have a resonance, I think, that now is enough to mobilize people if they understand how we are actively contributing to denying many people exactly those things that we declare to be the objects of their fundamental human rights. So I think that's where the momentum can come from, and then also from the realization that is part of what I try to convey in this lecture, that the cost to us affluent people isn't enormous. right? Slavery, or the end of slavery, wasn't the end of the world for those who used to own slaves. They were still very comfortable. They continued to live prosperously. And the same is true here with the end of poverty. When I tell you that 1/3 of all human deaths are poverty-related, that half of all human beings live in severe poverty and so on, you say, well, that's a huge problem. We can't possibly deal with it. But when you then realize that it's a matter of trying to get the bottom half from 3% up to 5% of global household income, suddenly the thing seems like a piece of cake. You know, we fought the Second World War, where we devoted somewhere around 50% of gross national product to the war effort. We, the Russians, the French, the British, the Germans, they all pretty much spent 50% of GNP. This problem is larger in terms of human suffering even than the Second World War, and it would be much, much, much cheaper to completely defeat. There's not an enemy out there who is fighting us, right? Everybody could work together. And if we could just rechannel 2% of the world's product towards the bottom half, we'd be done with the poverty problem once and for all. So, yeah, two.
I think Annie.
No, I was just going to say, you know, we read Thomas Friedman and believe in what he says. It seems to me that Bill Gates should have joined this effort rather than after the fact contributing all that money to eradicate some of the ills that he is doing. How do you change that?
Well, I'm very grateful that Gates is giving so much money, right? It is exceptional, and he has single-handedly revolutionized global health. I'm uncomfortable with the public role that he is assuming, that he's almost like a government now in the international arena, right? He's throwing his weight around in a massive way, and very little happens in the global health field without Gates having approved it beforehand and so on. So that's all dubious in various ways, but without him we would be in a much worse spot. But of course I agree with you that I don't want people to go out there rapaciously, make as much money as they can by lobbying for all sorts of terrible rules and then distributing band-aids afterwards to make it a little better, right? And I hope that if Gates had found the truth sort of that he found in the mid-90s at some point when he was under antitrust investigation, not coincidentally, if he had found that a little earlier, that maybe he wouldn't have done some of the things, some of the lobbying that he then subsequently, or earlier had done. Yeah, Maury.
I want to go out of human rights, but outside the content of your lecture.
Yeah.
And I'm comfortable that you're qualified to give us a responsive answer. And that is, you were elected president of the United States 6 months ago, and Syria came along. What would you have done?
Well, that's okay. Yeah, so the Syria situation, I would say this is not sort of connected. So if you don't like the Syria answer, don't throw everything out that I said before. But I think a very important mistake in US foreign policy was to encourage the opposition very strongly at the beginning, right? So saying, like Hillary Clinton did early on, Assad has to go. If you say Assad has to go, you are greatly encouraging the opposition, and they really mobilized and they sacrificed enormously to create a credible resistance movement within Syria. And in the end, the US was dragging its feet, was not following through with, for example, it took a long, long time to deliver supplies to the rebels and so on. So I think we did once again something that we've done a lot in the past, namely we encouraged resistance, and then when push came to shove, we sort of said, well, sorry, you don't seem to be winning the civil war over there. So it is better to take a clear line one way or the other. One way is to say, well, we say right from the start, we are not going to help you. And if you want to rebel, that's your right, it's your country, but just be aware of the fact that we are not going to help you. And the noises we made were the opposite, I think. Were noises of encouragement and suggesting that we were going to help and we were going to behind the scenes in some ways and so on. And so whether, which of the two strategies was the right strategy, I don't know. But the key thing is, if you are not going to help, say this clearly up front. If you make encouraging noises, then follow through with them. I think you had a point, yeah.
Slavery had a human face, which doesn't explain why it hung on for so long, but it had a more human face. Haven't you, by defining the nature of this problem as one that lacks transparency and that works behind the scenes on a supranational level, and which is heavily funded by industries that have already made money, made it more difficult to reach the heart of the average person?
Yeah, but that's not my choice, right? I mean, the problem is what the problem is. I'm trying to analyze it. I'm trying to say how do we explain the fact that with rising average incomes, with very healthy economic growth since the end of the Second World War, we still have this enormous poverty problem around. And the explanation is what the explanation is. I may be wrong about the explanation, but if this is the explanation, we have to understand it, right? We can't sort of give a wrong explanation to people just so that they may be more highly motivated. And I think, of course, poverty has a face. It is not, you can see the pictures of poor people. You can see what it is like to be poor. I spent 4 months when I was a graduate student traveling through Asia, and I just couldn't believe my eyes. I couldn't believe that there was the kind of poverty that I was seeing. And so seeing poverty firsthand was certainly, for me, a very decisive experience that motivated me to take it seriously and to become somebody who works on poverty, thinks about poverty, tries to do something about poverty. So it does have a human face, but what you are alluding to and what is completely right is that the factors that explain its persistence are very, very complicated, right? In slavery, it's a stark Manichaean picture. You have the slave tied to the tree, and you have the slaveholder with the whip whipping the hell out of that poor slave. But with poverty, it's a much more complicated relationship of power and domination that keeps some people in poverty and makes others very, very rich.
The way of looking at a human situation, seeing it either as a tragedy that calls for compassion and help, or as something that will trigger a lucrative business enterprise or investment, struck home with me right after the earthquake, the tsunami in Asia. I happened to be in Ecuador, and we were staying at the same hotel as George H.W. Bush, father. And in the course of the things I was involved in, I got to know the interpreter that handled that meeting. And she said that she was never so depressed as when she was an American citizen. She had to handle the interpretation of what George H.W. Bush said when Lucio, the president of Ecuador, was lamenting this horror, this catastrophe of so many people being displaced and killed and whatever. And George H.W. Bush said, Lucio, you have to see it as a business opportunity. And she said to me, she said, I hate it.
Yeah, and she had to translate that.
She said, I had to translate it.
Yeah.
So the pharmaceutical companies, the software companies, the agricultural companies are they're the knights in shining armor coming on the scene and saying you've got more antibiotics, you've got more corn and rice. Yeah, I have if I can quickly say one sentence on this, there was a quote that is similar in the trip with regard to the TRIPS agreement, where the Novartis chief executive said something like, well, India now has 50 million customers. Which, of course, India has 1.2 billion people, right? But India now has 50 million. India is an important country, has 50 million customers. Those who can afford to buy patented medicine. And of course, that's a good reason to withhold it from the others, to price it out of the reach of the others, because you can't milk the top 50 million and charge them very high prices for medicine unless you block other avenues on which Indians can get that medicine.
Steve, one more question. Steve.
You made a very compelling case based on a social justice argument and assuming, and I think we all share the values that, that justify your principles. But it is possible, as an earlier question, as Professor Gudjon's question implied, for someone to come up with a different framework, a different moral framework that might question the particular principles on which this whole argument is based. Isn't there another element to this argument that is more likely to get traction in changing anything, which is that of self-interest? As that red box with the 5% grows, and the boxes on the bottom end get smaller, aren't we creating a greater and greater disequilibrium in the world, which we're already seeing through international terrorism and Somali piratism and all of the various manifestations of the poor against the rich? And we've all got that target on our back. And the larger that box gets, the more we look like a justifiable target. Because as you point out, we tolerate the system that allows us. And not only that, our government officials who may attempt to fight that system may find themselves out of office because our own political rules make it difficult for those who don't play along with the lobbying to survive politically. So my question is whether that might add additional traction to the argument.
Yeah, so in principle, yes. So I have spent a good bit of time and effort trying to find prudential arguments and targeting in particular those institutional reforms where we have prudential support that we can enlist. So I'm a little bit wary of the specific argument that you make, that it is sort of a security issue, because I think that declaring things to be security issues has a, there is a significant downside and so on, because it immediately gets the trigger-happy folks into the picture, and they say, well, security issue, we know a thing or two about security, and we know how to, we know how to protect you and so on. But here are some examples. So the two issues that I've invested most time in the last 2 or 3 years are, on the one hand, an alternative to the pharmaceutical patents regime called the Health Impact Fund, where you can enlist, for example, patients in the rich countries. American citizens are, or the US in general, is investing 1/6 of its entire gross national product into healthcare. And we are ranking 37th in the world hierarchy in terms of health, which is not impressive. And we are paying way more than anybody else for medicines, for example. So here is a way where we can say this system, as we now have it, is not only bad for poor populations, but it's also bad for rich populations. Pharmaceutical companies are not really interested in health. To the contrary, they're interested in, they get paid for people being sick and for selling the maintenance drugs rather than cures and so on. So the present system provides incentives that we should be, as consumers in the United States, very wary of. And here we can make common cause with, the reform proposal that I give is a reform proposal that is one that would be in the best interests of American consumers, in the best interest of developing country consumers, and so on. And the other one is in the area of illicit financial flows, where I say we should shut down secrecy jurisdictions, no more secret bank accounts. If your name is not on the money, it's not your money, sorry. No more property rights that are not acknowledged, right, where the owner is some number or some shell company or something like that. If the real owners are not known, the money has no owner, and that's the end of that. And that's what we should institutionalize internationally. And again, you can get strong support out of the vast majority of American taxpayers who honestly pay their taxes and who don't see why some people should get away with having these secret bank accounts in Switzerland, Singapore, Cayman Islands, or whatever. So illicit financial flows is another issue. So I think it's fundamentally very important to realize that at this stage of the game, moral arguments alone cannot carry the day. You have to, I think, band together with interested parties within maybe the 5% or the top quarter and recognize that they are not homogeneous. It's not just sort of one block of people who all march in lockstep and all have the same interests. They have very diverse interests, and you have to pick out your natural allies and say, here is something that is good for you and also morally good, so let's do it together.